Imagine a night so cold your breath freezes midair, and your bed is made of straw, dirt, and regret. Tonight, we go back, way back, to meet the unsung survivors of winter's harshest bite, the medieval peasants. No castles, no crowns, just grit, mud, and the desperate genius of staying alive. When we think of winter today, most of us imagine warm drinks, soft blankets, and perhaps a quiet snowfall viewed through double-glazed windows. But for the average medieval peasant, winter wasn't a season. It was an enemy. One that came each year with icy claws, creeping into every crack, every corner of their fragile world. You weren't waking up to snow angels. You were waking up and hoping your toes hadn't turned blue overnight. These peasants didn't have heated floors or cozy fireplaces. Most lived in what historians politely call wattle and daub huts, crisscrossed wooden frames smeared with mud and animal dung. If it sounds flimsy, that's because it was. The wind had a habit of slipping in like an uninvited ghost, howling through gaps in the walls and laughing as it curled around shivering bodies. And no, there were no real windows. Maybe a hole in the wall stuffed with cowhide or animal stomach. Glass? That was something the local lord might have heard of, once. The cold didn't politely knock. It barged in. Inside these one-room homes, temperatures hovered just a whisper above what was happening outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was slightly less freezing with goat aroma indoors. And that, sadly, was considered a win. Now, if you're enjoying this chilly journey so far, consider tapping that like button and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know, and gives us a warm reason to keep these stories alive for you. Also, drop a comment telling us what time it is where you're listening. We love seeing how far this cozy little storytelling community reaches. Back in medieval times, once the sun dipped, the real battle began. Nights were long, dark, and unforgiving. The wind screeched like a banshee, and the hearth, if you had one, spat smoke and sparks, valiantly trying to warm the nearest pair of frozen toes. If you sat too far from the fire, you might as well have been camping. Outside. In January. With worse snacks. And what about clothing? Forget fur-lined jackets or thermal underwear. Peasants often had two tunics at most. Thick, itchy wool layered over linen, maybe a goat-smelling cloak tossed on top. Boots were a luxury. Many wrapped their feet in rags and hoped the mud didn't freeze through. As for bedding, let's just say luxury mattress meant a sack of straw crawling with uninvited guests. If you were lucky, it was dry. If you weren't, well, you got character-building lessons in endurance. But the cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was lethal. Frostbite didn't care if you had chores in the morning. Pneumonia could creep in through a single gasp of icy air. And a single cold night could claim a child, an elder, or an entire household. So, each morning, if you woke up and your breath was still fogging up the air, that was victory. That was a reason to celebrate, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. Winter wasn't an inconvenience for medieval peasants. It was a test of survival that returned every year, ruthless and unrelenting. And yet, they found ways to fight back. But how? How do you survive the nights when even the dirt beneath you turns to ice? The houses that shielded medieval peasants from the outside world were, in truth, little more than hollow suggestions of shelter. Built from wattle and daub, thin lattices of wooden slats slathered in a blend of mud, straw, and dung, these structures were not fortresses, but fragile skins stretched between the peasant and the cold. The walls cracked with the shift of seasons. Rain softened them, frost split them, and over time, the protective layer thinned until the wind began to whistle through with alarming familiarity. You didn't need a door to know when winter arrived. You could feel it brushing against your skin before sunrise, seeping through the gaps where the daub had given up and the mud had fallen away. These homes were one-room spaces. No halls, no corridors, no privacy. A single shared chamber was where the family slept, ate, worked, birthed children, nursed the sick, and watched over the fire. At the heart of it all stood the hearth, a smoky pit of warmth and ash, often without a chimney. Instead of rising cleanly through a flue, the smoke billowed out through holes in the roof, cracks in the eaves, or sometimes not at all, hanging thick and heavy in the room like a second ceiling. The thatched roof above might have looked picturesque in a storybook sense, but it was far from dependable. Made from bundles of reeds or straw, it was prone to sagging under the weight of snow, leaking under persistent rain, or even admitting the occasional squirrel or rat, uninvited guests descending into the middle of dinner or curling into a corner of your bedroll. And then there were the windows, if they existed at all. Most were no more than hand-sized holes cut into the walls, perhaps covered with thin animal skins or wooden shutters. Glass, when it appeared, was a sign of absurd luxury, reserved for the manor house or the church. For the peasant, if the wind didn't tear the cowhide off the frame mid-blizzard, it was considered a good night. The floor, if it could be called that, was simply earth. It was not uncommon for the very same mud that built the walls to lie beneath your feet. During heavy rains or deep winter, that floor became a semi-liquid bog. Mud bubbled up into the house itself. No dramatic flooding, just a quiet, persistent dampness that crept up into straw beds and soaked through every woven reed mat. And yet they endured. The peasants fought back not with bricks or mortar, but with improvisation. Cracks were plugged with moss or rags. Extra layers of mud were smeared across walls in the hopes of thickening the barrier. Sometimes, the mixture was fortified with more dung, rubbed in cold and stiff by hands already too numb to feel the texture. A roof leak might be stuffed with dry grass, rags, even turf stolen from a neighbor's pasture. And if a shutter wouldn't stay put, an iron nail and shear wool might do the trick. Every winter brought new weaknesses in the home's defenses, and every winter, peasants patched and pushed back. Because to do otherwise was to accept defeat. And defeat, in the dead of winter, came quietly. It didn't announce itself with screams or battles. It crept into the home with frost on its breath and silence in its wake. But even these ramshackle structures were not the most treacherous part of winter. The true enemy lay beneath the feet, an invisible force that chilled from the ground up, seeping through straw and skin and soul. And so, in the next breath of our journey, we'll move downward, not outward, into the cold that rises from the earth itself. Part 3. If the biting wind and broken walls weren't enough, the cold beneath your feet completed the siege. In the medieval world, there was no such thing as flooring, not for peasants. The ground was the floor. Hardened earth, trodden down over generations, packed firm by bare feet and the slow, heavy rhythm of survival. But come winter, this ground transformed. It froze with quiet hostility, becoming more than an inconvenience, it became an accomplice of the cold. Heat fled upward, and the icy weight of the soil pressed against everything: boots, straw mats, even the bones of those trying to sleep above it. Peasants tried what they could. If there was straw to spare, it would be layered thickly over the dirt in an effort to create a barrier, a brittle mattress between flesh and frost. But straw flattened quickly. It molded. It grew soft and sour. It crackled when dry and squelched when damp. And it was rarely changed. Rushes offered a temporary alternative. Long grasses gathered in bunches and spread across the floor, sometimes scented with herbs like rosemary or lavender to mask the overwhelming odor of livestock and unwashed bodies. But the fragrance faded quickly. Within days, the rushes became a compacted mash of dirt, sweat, and crumbs from 1,000 meager meals. Still, it was better than nothing. It was something to stand on that didn't bite back. Beds, when they existed, were crude wooden frames packed with hay. No linen sheets, no goose feathers. Just a sack of dry plant matter that offered little more than a psychological illusion of comfort. And for most, even that illusion was beyond reach. Many peasants slept directly on the floor, curled up with children, cloaks and, when luck allowed, an animal or two. And yet, Even these efforts to escape the frozen earth rarely succeeded. The cold found its way through the cracks, through the damp straw, through the gaps in a tunic threadbare from years of wear. It crept up slowly, like fog seeping into the body. It started in the feet, then the spine, then the chest. By morning, it had claimed every muscle and joint in its silent conquest. There was no true rest in winter. Sleep was not a gentle descent but a struggle, an unconscious act of survival, a fight to hold on to heat just long enough to wake up again. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was about circulation, about shifting just enough to keep the blood moving, to keep one side of your body from freezing while the other side thawed. Even the smallest miscalculation could be punishing. Drop a spoon, a cloth, or a child's wooden toy onto the floor during a midnight meal, and by dawn, it might as well be part of the permafrost. Everything adhered to the cold ground like it had been swallowed into the grave. And yet, amid all this, peasants learned. They learned to pile rushes higher, to steal straw when they could, to sleep in bundles, to wrap feet in extra cloth and tuck children beneath layers of cloaks and rags. The floor might be ice, but they did not lie down without a fight. Because above the dirt, in the smoky air lit dimly by the hearth's glow, there remained one fragile promise. A source of warmth, of light, of life. The fire. In the frozen heart of every peasant home, amid the damp rushes and groaning beams, one thing stood as both sentinel and salvation: the hearth. It was no grand fireplace. There were no carved mantles or curling smoke rising neatly from a chimney. Instead, the medieval hearth was a simple pit dug into the center of the room, or a rough circle of stones blackened by years of soot and prayers. Its flames danced low and stubborn, often choked by damp wood and the smoke that refused to rise cleanly through the roof. But it was warm. And that meant everything. The hearth was not just a fire, it was the living pulse of the household. It gave heat, yes, but also light in the darkness, a place to cook, a reason to gather. When the winds shrieked and the stars disappeared behind sheets of snow, the family circled close, knees to knees, elbows to ribs, breathing in smoke because it was better than breathing in ice. It was a fickle ally. Without proper ventilation, the air grew heavy and acrid. You'd wake in the middle of the night, your throat raw and your chest tight, wondering if warmth was worth the coughing fit. And yet, the smoke had its own twisted generosity. It killed fleas. It smoked out rats. It turned your hut into something unlivable for pests, but just tolerable enough for people. Keeping the fire alive was not an act of convenience. It was duty. Sacred, constant, unspoken. To let it die was to invite winter in like a thief. There were no matches. No easy sparks. Reigniting a dead fire meant flint, steel, bone-dry kindling, and time. Time you didn't have when your children were already shivering and the wind was testing the shutters. So, the fire was tended. Night after night, someone sat vigil beside the coals, feeding it scraps of wood, peat, or dung, whatever fuel could be spared. The flicker of flame became a rhythm to live by. And when sleep finally called, they didn't extinguish the fire, they banked it. To bank a fire was a small miracle of folk knowledge. The embers were carefully buried beneath a mound of ash, creating a fragile shell that preserved their heat through the long hours of cold. Come morning, you would kneel beside that silent mound, dig gently, and if the fire gods had been kind, find a glow waiting, a spark of yesterday's warmth still alive. But fire could not be left unguarded. Even banked, it might go out. A sudden draft could smother it. A wandering sheep might knock over the coals. And so, the household took shifts. Someone always woke in the dark to check it. A grandmother's creaking bones, a child's sleepy hands, whoever could manage would rise and breathe life back into the orange glow. This was the fire's covenant. It warmed, but it demanded everything in return: attention, sacrifice, reverence. For those in the cold's grip, the fire was not comfort. It was defiance. a line drawn in ash against the creeping death beyond the door. Yet even the fire was not enough. The heat did not reach far. Its fingers could not stretch across the room. At best, it warmed a circle uneven and unreliable. One side of your body basked in its glow, the other froze in shadow. So the peasants adapted again, not with more wood, but with more bodies. And that, quietly, leads us into the next layer of survival, the embrace of human heat. Where fire left off, flesh and breath took over. And in the huddled silence of long winter nights, the peasant family became its own furnace. When the fire could do no more, when its orange glow dimmed and its heat barely kissed the stone floor, there was only one strategy left: each other. The medieval bed was not an object. It was an arrangement, a negotiation of limbs, a pile of cloaks, a collective attempt to trap warmth before it escaped into the air. Families did not sleep apart. They became a single breathing creature, pressed shoulder to shoulder, cheek to shoulder blade, spine to spine. Children, elders, mothers, fathers, there were no boundaries in the cold. At night, everyone migrated to the warmest corner of the room, usually near the hearth, sometimes behind a wall stuffed with moss. There they formed a shape, loose at first, then tighter as the cold deepened. The strongest and sturdiest slept at the edges, absorbing the bite of drafts. Infants and the elderly were curled into the center, wrapped in what few rags or woolen tunics remained. There was no luxury, no softness, and certainly no privacy. It wasn't a bed. It was a necessity. Human heat, compressed into one spot, could push back just enough to survive until morning. And it wasn't just people. Animals were welcomed in. Chickens, pigs, dogs, goats. Anything that gave off warmth was a guest. A snorting pig might curl against your back. A dog might tuck itself between your legs. The peasant house at night was not quiet. It breathed, shuffled, twitched. It was a barn, a nursery, a fortress of breath and shared body heat. There were hazards, of course. You might wake to a goat chewing on your hair, or find a suspicious warmth near your feet that wasn't yours. But no one complained. A house filled with life, however chaotic, noisy, or pungent, was a house not claimed by frost. Sometimes, straw mattresses were shared. Worn flat and riddled with fleas, they were still better than lying directly on the damp floor. If you were lucky, your sleeping space didn't sink too deeply into the flattened rushes. If you were unlucky, you ended up near the edge, shivering while someone's elbows jabbed your ribs and a cow snored in your ear. But this nightly heap wasn't just about warmth. It was memory. It was ritual. These cold nights became stories, passed on by firelight. Children learned the importance of stillness, of wrapping cloaks tight, of placing warm stones near their feet. And in the middle of it all, laughter sometimes found its way through the smoke and the cold. A joke, a soft song, a whispered tale, reminders that survival wasn't only about endurance. It was about spirit. This human pile, this living nest, was the last line of defense. If you woke up sore, itchy, and half covered in goat hair, it meant something beautiful: you had woken up. And still, even this wasn't enough. When the air turned sharp as glass and the frost crawled along the beams above, the peasants reached for deeper layers, more than fabric, more than fire. They reached for ritual, for method, for knowledge passed down in hands and breath. The next defense? Fire's memory, banked embers hidden beneath ash, burning low, waiting to be called upon again. In a world without matches, without fuel to spare, without second chances, the ember became sacred. Letting the fire die overnight wasn't just careless, it was dangerous. A cold hearth was a death sentence delivered in silence, sometime before dawn. And so, every medieval peasant learned the art, the ritual, of fire banking. By the last hour of wakefulness, when the hut had settled into breathy stillness and only a few red coals blinked in the ashes, someone would kneel by the fire. Usually a parent, a grandparent, sometimes a child who had watched and learned. They wouldn't feed the flames. They would bury them. With cupped hands or a wooden scoop, they'd spread ash gently over the glowing embers, tucking them in like a child into a cradle. Ash was no longer waste. It was blanket, protector, guardian. Insulating the heat from air, from wind, from time itself. If done right, the coals would rest all night beneath their shroud, warm but hidden, breathing slowly in their sleep. If done wrong, they would vanish. And in the morning, you'd be left with nothing but gray dust and dread. Rekindling a dead fire was an ordeal. You needed dry tinder, scarce in winter. Flint and steel, not always reliable. And patience, hard to find when your fingers were numb and the cold had settled into your lungs like stone. So, banking the fire was not just a chore. It was a ritual, a gamble, a skill passed through generations. Some said the ash had to be completely dry. Others swore a bit of dampness held the heat better. Some packed the coals tightly, others left small channels for breath. Every household had its own method, its own superstition, its own whispered prayer before bed. And sometimes, even that wasn't enough. A sudden gust might sneak through the thatch and scatter the ashes. A curious goat might step too close. A wet log placed too early could smother everything. That's why, on especially brutal nights, someone always took a shift, rising in the dark to prod the mound, to listen for the faint hiss of heat, to feed the embers just enough to keep them alive. These were the ember watchers, the midnight sentinels. Children who grew up with sleepy eyes and sooty hands. Elders who could read the fire's mood like a heartbeat. Parents who whispered instructions in the dark, training the next generation in this quiet act of survival. It wasn't glamorous. It was smoke in your lungs, ash under your nails, aching knees on frozen earth. But it was life. And in a home where every degree mattered, that tiny coal glowing beneath a layer of ash was a promise. Morning would come. The ember was not just fire. It was memory. It was yesterday's warmth, stretched into tomorrow. And yet, even the best tended hearth could not reach every corner, every limb. The fire may have survived the night, but now, the morning brought new threats. The cold beneath your feet. The draft from the door. The bitter air stealing warmth from your lungs. So they turned to another tactic. A more primal one. Food. Not to nourish, but to burn from within. Next, we'll feel that warmth from the inside out. In the dead of winter, food was more than survival. It was internal fire. A warm stew eaten before bed could mean the difference between shivering in a haze of hunger and drifting into a sleep that didn't flirt with death. For the medieval peasant, calories weren't luxury, they were armor. And digestion, strange as it sounds, was the body's quiet furnace, burning deep in the belly while frost rattled at the door. There were no late-night snacks for comfort. There were strategic meals, timed with care. Heavy, fibrous, slow to digest. The kind that sat in your gut like a warm stone and stayed there until the cold of morning. Root vegetables were the mainstay: turnips, onions, parsnips, anything that could be yanked from the earth before it froze solid. Add barley or oats, maybe a crust of chewy rye bread, and if you were truly lucky, a sliver of salted pork or a bone to flavor the pot. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't fragrant. But it filled the stomach, and more importantly, it raised the body's temperature just enough. There was no science behind this, not in the way we know it. No one spoke of thermic effect or metabolic heat production. But the knowledge passed through generations was clear: you sleep warmer on a full belly. And so, parents insisted. Even the pickiest child was made to eat, because a skipped bowl of porridge could mean a sleepless night wrapped in trembling limbs. Eat your turnips, they would say, or you'll wish you had. There were risks, of course. A full stomach meant strange dreams, vivid, strange visions stirred by slow digestion and the cold's grasping fingers. But dreams were better than chills. And so the pot stayed on the fire as long as embers remained. This was winter's great equation: fire outside, food inside, and the fragile line of breath between them. But food was not just sustenance, it was rhythm. Meals brought families together. In the stillness of frozen nights, the scrape of spoons on clay bowls was a kind of music. Silence filled with chewing, stories, laughter. The steam rising from the stew pot became the village's breath. And if the stew grew thin and the turnips ran out, they improvised. Grain mash, toasted crumbs, even warmed broth thickened with nothing but yesterday's bread. It was not about flavor. It was about survival by warmth. Yet even the warmth of food faded. Even a belly full of barley could not block out the bitter wind entirely. And so they turned to strange inventions, tools and tricks, passed down like sacred heirlooms. Boxes of hay. Stones from the hearth. Primitive, yes, but quietly brilliant. Even when the belly was full and the fire carefully banked, the cold still crept in. Silent, insistent, unforgiving. So medieval peasants turned to what they had left: stones, hay, and a quiet kind of genius. The hay box was simple. A wooden crate or old barrel, stuffed with thick hay, packed so tightly it trapped warmth like a woolen cloak. Originally, it was meant for food, an early slow cooker. A hot pot of stew could be buried in the hay and kept warm for hours, long after the fire had faded. But its usefulness didn't end at the supper table. Because if hay could keep a stew warm, why not a body? The answer came in the form of rocks. Before sleep, someone, usually the youngest or the one who lost the family argument, would take a flat stone and bury it deep in the coals of the hearth. Let it sit. Let it soak up the fire's memory until it nearly glowed. Then, with tongs or a stick, they would lift it, carefully, gingerly, praying it didn't crack or shatter, and wrap it in cloth or slip it into an old clay pot. This, then, was the peasant's heating pad. The hot stone would be tucked at the foot of the bedding, slipped beneath straw, hay, or ragged blankets. It radiated a soft, fading heat that could last into the first hours of sleep. Enough, perhaps, to get the blood flowing in numbed feet. Enough to remind the body, you're still alive. But it wasn't foolproof. Wrap the stone too loosely, and you'd burn a hole through the bedding, or your leg. Wrap it too tightly, and it held in moisture, turning cold and clammy before midnight. And of course, there was always the danger of tripping in the dark and dropping the rock entirely. A sprained toe or scorched ankle was an unpleasant addition to an already miserable night. Still, it was worth the risk. That moment, just after crawling into straw bedding, just before the warmth bled away, when the heat from the stone kissed your skin. That was medieval luxury. Some families had only one good stone. It became prized property. Children fought for it, parents negotiated over it. It was passed from bed to bed like a secret, burning warm beneath layers of straw and hope. Others used simpler methods: bricks from the hearth, wrapped in rags. Or even heated tiles, if their hut had any. But stones were best. Stones remembered the fire. Of course, by morning, the stone was cold again. The hay stale, the fire a whisper. And winter was waiting at the door, eager to creep in. So you dressed, layered, wrapped and bundled, knowing that warmth was not a given. It was earned, fought for, preserved. And you carried the stone's memory with you into the new day, until fire and food and flesh repeated their nightly rhythm again. Still, there was one more piece to the puzzle. Something not made of stone or hay. Something older, deeper, more intimate. The human breath. By now, the peasant had done all they could. They had eaten their stew, buried a stone in straw, banked the fire, huddled in a pile of limbs and wool, and yet the cold still found a way. It slid under the door, drifted through the rafters, wrapped around ankles like a hungry ghost. So they turned to the last defense, their breath. In a world where pneumonia was a death sentence and doctors were a rumor, even breathing had to become a strategy. Mouth breathing in winter meant trouble. A single gulp of icy air could send frost into your lungs, leave you coughing until your ribs ached. So peasants were taught from childhood, breathe through the nose always. It was called many things. Quiet breath. Warm breath. Night breath. But what it really was survival. Inhaling through the nose warmed the air slightly, filtered it, gave the body time to prepare. Exhaling slowly kept heat from escaping too fast. Each breath was shallow, careful, deliberate, as if they feared the cold might sneak in on a single gasp. At night, when the fire was low and blankets were thin, many wrapped scarves or rags around their faces. Not for fashion. For warmth. The cloth would catch the exhale and hold its ghost of heat just a moment longer, enough to warm the next breath. Damp? Absolutely. Sometimes freezing stiff by morning. But worth it. Children were taught the ritual early. Mothers scolded them for panting like dogs. Fathers reminded them, slow down. Breathe soft. Breathe smart. Not because it was polite, but because it might keep them alive until morning. And so, tucked under straw, buried in cloaks, wrapped in goat-smelling wool and cow breath, the peasant closed their eyes and began the slow rhythm of winter breathing. In through the nose. Out slow. Less heat lost. Less cold gained. The breath became a meditation. A kind of prayer. Because in the silence of medieval night, when wind scraped the roof and frost painted the walls, every breath was a decision, to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep hoping. But even breath alone wasn't always enough. Even with food and fire and flint and faith, the cold could still take its toll. So peasants looked outward. They turned to their neighbors, not just for help, but for warmth, for shared life, for survival. In the harsh stillness of medieval winter, even breathing wasn't a solo act for long. Warmth was too precious to hoard. Life depended on closeness, not emotional but physical. And so they slept together. Not in separate beds. Not even in separate rooms. Entire families, parents, children, grandparents, sometimes neighbors, sometimes animals, piled into one space, one bundle, one heaving tangle of breath and body heat. It wasn't affection. It was insulation. On the coldest nights, people didn't sleep where they liked. They slept where it made sense. Elders and babies, the most fragile, were tucked deep in the center. Stronger bodies formed the outer layers, a living barrier against drafts and death. It was the medieval lasagna, layers of humans, stacked with blankets and straw, breathing in sync. Children wriggled between adults like worms in a nest. Elders groaned as stiff bones pressed into dirt floors. Aunts, uncles, cousins, distant relatives, if they were within walking distance, they were probably on your sleeping mat. And if they brought warmth, all the better. Animals too found a place. Goats huddled beside children. Chickens roost in rafters. Pigs stretched out by the fire like royalty. Their breath filled the room with heat, and with smell. But nobody complained. The warmth of a snoring cow was worth a dozen candles. Space was rationed by warmth. If your feet strayed too far from the group, the cold would find them. If you moved too much, you'd risk knocking someone into the icy corner of the hut. That person might be your grandmother. Or your goat. Either way, you were in trouble. Bedding was often shared, a single mattress of flattened hay or rushes, moldy in places, lumpy in others, alive with fleas. But the goal wasn't comfort. It was survival. And so they lay side by side, turnip-bellied and soot-faced, tangled in cloaks and dreams. There was no shame in it. No awkwardness. Sleeping together was as normal as eating together. It was rhythm. Tradition. The way things were done. And within that closeness, something else took root, something quiet and powerful. Stories. In the dark, under itchy wool and low beams, voices would rise, a mother whispering a tale, a grandfather singing a slow, tuneless song, a child asking why stars twinkled or why wind howled like wolves. The cold forged closeness, not just of skin but of soul. By morning, backs ached and limbs tingled. But breath still fogged the air. Eyes still opened. And that meant one thing: they had made it through the night. Together. But while the family shared one bed, the true strength of survival went even further, beyond blood, beyond walls. Because when winter tightened its grip, even one household wasn't enough. Next came the village. And the unspoken pact that no one survived alone. In the coldest months, even a well-banked fire and a tightly packed family couldn't always guarantee survival. Sometimes the embers died. Sometimes the thatch gave way under snow. Sometimes sickness stole warmth from within, no matter how many cloaks you wore. That's when the village stepped in. Because in medieval winters, fire wasn't just a household necessity, it was a shared currency, a social contract, a lifeline that passed from one hand to another like sacred flame. If your hearth went cold in the night, the village would know. Someone always knew. Smoke no longer curling from a chimney. A door that hadn't opened in 2 days. A child not seen at the well. These were the signs, and they were never ignored. So someone came. Often with a bundle of hot coals wrapped in rags, or a wooden box with a single glowing ember, carefully carried through snow and wind like treasure. No permission needed. You shared your fire because one day, you would need theirs. This wasn't charity. It was survival math. Even the weakest had roles. The elderly, too frail for fields, became watchers. They kept lists in their minds: whose roof leaked, whose cough lingered, whose chickens were too quiet. Children ran messages. Teenagers split wood for widows and ferried dry rushes to neighbors with leaky floors. And when disaster struck, a roof collapse, a sickness, a fire that went out too early, the community gathered quickly without debate. You lent hands, food, warmth. You made room. Yes, people quarreled. There were grudges, suspicions, old slights about goats or land. But in winter, those faded. Because everyone knew, if your neighbor froze tonight, tomorrow it might be you. There were no social safety nets. The village was the net. Tattered, patched, stubborn, but strong enough, just enough to catch the falling. Shared meals, too, became lifelines. When grain stores ran low and stew pots thinned to little more than boiled water and hope, families combined what they had. One onion here, a turnip there, a precious hunk of dried meat saved from a better season. It all went into the same pot. Nobody had much. But together, they had enough. And around the communal fire, warmth returned, not just to the hands and feet, but to the spirit. A joke told. A story shared. A song hummed. The kindling of something more than flame. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't poetic. But it was human. Raw. Resilient. Real. And it was how they endured. One ember, one breath, one neighbor at a time. Because the truth was simple and solemn. No one outlasted winter alone. But even with fire shared and bellies warmed, there was one more thing they turned to when all else thinned and trembled. They turned to faith. When the woodpile was low, when the embers barely glowed, when every draft in the wall felt like a whisper from death itself, there was still one thing left to wrap around the soul: prayer. In the medieval world, faith wasn't decoration. It was armor. Every night, before crawling into the straw and wool, families knelt together, on cold stone, on mud floors, beside sputtering fires, and prayed. Not in grand cathedrals, but in hovels that smelled of smoke and sheep, their voices quiet and urgent. They prayed for warmth, for breath, for survival, for the fire to hold through the night. Some whispered to the Virgin, protector of mothers and infants. Others called on Saint Blaise, guardian of the throat, because a cough in winter could mean a funeral in spring. Saint Nicholas, long before his red-suited reinvention, was invoked not for toys, but for protection against sudden ruin. And it wasn't just formal religion. Superstition tangled with scripture like vines on frostbitten wood. Some marked their doors with blessed chalk. Others sprinkled holy water near the hearth, hoping to keep evil, or misfortune, or merely mischief, at bay. Tiny vigil candles were left burning through the night, watched not just for their glow, but for their flicker, a sign that perhaps warmth still had a fighting chance. And always, beneath the words, one shared request: let us wake up. Because many didn't. Each winter, the village shrank. A neighbor gone. A child taken. A cough that never stopped. There were no memorials, only silence, and the sigh of someone laying extra straw on a now empty spot. Faith didn't promise safety, but it offered something just as vital: meaning, hope, a reason to try again. It told them spring would come, that no matter how long the dark, the light would return, that beneath all the suffering, there was a reason, or at least, a comfort in believing there might be one. In the end, the prayers didn't just ask for warmth. They were warmth. Whispered into smoke-filled rafters, tangled in brittle hay, clutched in chapped fingers, they were the final layer. The one that wrapped around the heart. And somehow, against every brutal odd, many made it. Because of fire. Because of food. Because of family. But also because they believed. And so, next time you sit by a fire, warm drink in hand, wrapped in fleece and silence, remember those who came before, who faced nights colder than we'll ever know, with nothing but smoke, straw, and stubborn hope. One ember. One breath. One whispered prayer at a time. If this quiet journey through medieval winter warmed your mind or heart, consider supporting the channel. Subscribe for more slow stories from forgotten corners of history. Like the video to let us know it reached you. Comment your favorite medieval survival trick, or just say where you're watching from.